Hello readers, I'm Amy and I'm your nonfiction feminist. Today I am going to talk about one of my favorite genres ever that I haven't been reading nearly enough of lately, and that is nonfiction. I feel like a lot of people get nervous about nonfiction. They might find it inaccessible or difficult to read or boring, so I'm here to talk about how to get into nonfiction. I have not always been a nonfiction fan. I didn't read any nonfiction until probably high school, and when I did start reading nonfiction, it was basically just books about Cleopatra, because I thought Cleopatra was pretty awesome. I also went through a Lucille Ball phase, and this was probably the first significant nonfiction that I read for me. And that was Love, Lucy, which is Lucille Ball's memoir. I thought this was amazing. It's kind of like her life story, and that piqued my interest, so it's like, okay, memoirs, biographies, cool. But the big moment for me in nonfiction was definitely going to college. In college, you have to read nonfiction. You have to do research papers. You have to look up other research papers so you can write about your research paper. And I figured I have all this work to do on my research. I might as well do something that I find interesting. So for my psychology classes, I was focusing a lot on gender. I had my women and gender studies minor and my sociology minor along with my psychology major. And I also really got into sex education in college and took a lot of sex education classes. So that was kind of my interest. So I'm like, all right, let's combine the psychology and the gender and the sex education for my papers, because that's what I'm interested in. And some of my teachers, instead of making us write about what they were interested in, some of my teachers actually let the students write about what they were interested in, which made college a lot easier for me whenever I had those particular classes where it's like, no, I'm not doing your research for you, I'm doing my own research. So anyways, in looking up papers to write my paper with, I came across Mary Roach and Bonk, and this is when it really took off for me. Bonk is the curious coupling of science and sex. Mary Roach is not a sexologist or other sex education expert. She is just a researching person who finds a topic that she's interested in and she dives into it. And I loved this book. I thought it was really hilarious. I thought her footnotes were great. I hear some people don't think her footnotes are that funny, but with me and my American sense of humor, I thought this was great. She goes into pig reproduction and how they'll use certain adult items to try and help the pig have more piglets. It can be hard to find people to take part in your studies whenever you're a sex researcher. So she went ahead and did some studies, which I won't go into detail on this channel, but you can definitely look it up. Goes into some genital surgeries, just really, really interesting stuff. I thought this was awesome. I wanted to include it in my papers, and it just got me interested. It's like, wow, this is nonfiction that's accessible, for one thing, which I will go into more later, and really funny and easy read, something that I'm interested in. Like, I'm gonna look at more of this. And the next book that I got into of hers was actually Stiff, which is her most well-known book, and that is about cadavers and how they use cadavers in colleges, and I think it's called The Body Farm, where they study decomposition in different ways, like on land or under the earth or in the water or all sorts of stuff. That's what really got me started on nonfiction, was finding something that I'm interested in. And that is going to be my number one recommendation for you in this video. Find something that you're passionate about, that you're really, really interested in. I will have some recommendations throughout this video, but yeah, if you're interested in food, find some books on food. If you're interested in sex, find some books on sex and sex education. I have shelves and shelves and shelves of them back here. Just all sorts of stuff. There is nonfiction out there for everyone, and not all of it is daunting. My next suggestion for finding a nonfiction you might be interested in, I'm going to go back to Love, Lucy and say, find a familiar person. If you're really interested in Cleopatra like I was in high school, find some books on Cleopatra. If you think that Lucille Ball is like the funniest comedian of the 1900s and you think she's awesome and you own every single episode of I Love Lucy and a lot of episodes of The Lucy Show and several collectible items, then read this book. Finding people that you're interested in could also get you really interested in nonfiction. You have an investment in it. You're like, this person's really awesome. I want to learn from their life, so I'm going to investigate their life by reading their memoir, autobiography, biography, what have you. My next suggestion would be to read in sections. If you're having trouble with nonfiction, if you're struggling through reading it, then I suggest not trying to read all of it at once. A lot of fiction books we read in chunks because we're really into the atmosphere, we can't put it down, sort of a thing. Nonfiction can be a little different. For this, I have the example of Blitzed, Drugs and the Third Reich. This was a really interesting book on how Hitler's doctor was the one who was really in control of Germany because he was in control of the main man. And as interesting as this book was, and as interesting as the drug research was, and the doctor, and the people that you meet, and the things that people did with meth before they knew it was dangerous, it was kind of tough to get through. This is a fairly average-sized book, but this entire thing is only comprised of 4 chapters, and there's not a ton of page breaks. The chapters are kind of sectioned off, but with as much type as there is in here, and only having the 4 chapters in the book, it was hard for me to read. My personal taste leans towards shorter chapters that are more digestible. I like to stop reading when I come to the end of a chapter, and that just makes reading easier for me. So having a really good book that only had 4 chapters in it, that was tough because it's just these huge sections of all one topic instead of dividing each section into its own chapter. So flip through a nonfiction that you might be interested in and just see how it's sectioned off, and maybe that'll make the reading a little bit easier for you. My next recommendation is one that I would love to do a video on, but I just don't have enough material right now, and that is to find a nonfiction book that reads like a novel. Now when I say that, I only have 2 examples currently. Like I said, I would love to do a full video on this, but I need more than 2 books to do that, or at least I want more than 2 books to do that. For this, I have The Zookeeper's Wife and Radium Girls. Both of these were awesome, and when I initially started reading The Zookeeper's Wife, I was thinking like, oh, it's a war story, maybe it's fiction, it's like about World War II, looking into it, it's like, oh, it must be a nonfiction. But in reading it, especially with the beginning, you have a lot of description, like feeling the wind come through the windows in the bedroom and seeing the light and hearing the sounds of the animals, and it's very descriptive and very stage setting in a way that feels like fiction. And it's not until you read the parts that say she was quoted that you realize, oh, this is actually a nonfiction, but the way that they describe things and set the atmosphere makes it feel more like a fiction book, and that can make it feel like a friendlier read. The other one that I have for this is Radium Girls. In, I'd say, the second half of this, it does go more into lawyer stuff and their legal battles for their health and for their lives. But overall, it still really felt like a novel. It had the feelings of the people who were involved in this. It had what that day's weather looked like. Just those little personal touches that made it easier to read and to dive into and to feel like you were really there and setting the atmosphere. So finding nonfiction that reads like a novel might be a little tricky, but not impossible. And these were just really amazing reads. I especially adore Radium Girls. Another way to get into nonfiction is, of course, watching the movies. Most of us love movies and TV. That's just kind of what happens at this day and age. For this, I have Wild. I didn't really hear too much about Wild until the movie came out, and everyone went wild for Wild. They were either watching the movie or they were reading the book. I have not seen the movie yet, but I did pick up the book, I read it, I thought it was awesome. I would like to see the movie eventually, but me personally, I'm happy with just having read the book. That said, if you struggle with nonfiction, actually, changing the topic a little bit here to classics. A huge thing with reading classics, a tip that I see across a lot of people's videos, is that if you're struggling to read classics, read something familiar. Read Pride and Prejudice and watch some of the movies that people have made. Or if you're really into Disney movies, then read some of the original books that the Disney movies were made from. Read the original Beauty and Beast. Read the original Peter Pan, because that's familiar material, and the nonfiction will feel a little friendlier because you're already familiar with the basic material. That could go the same with nonfiction. You have a memoir like Wild that was really popular and made into a movie. If you want to watch the movie before you read the book so you have some context for it, do that if it's going to make it easier for you. This book, I think, was very reader-friendly. Again, accessible, which is actually my next point, is accessibility. So that was a huge thing for me in college. In doing women and gender studies and sociology, I had to read books by Judith Butler. I hated it. I respect Judith Butler as a figure in women's and gender and feminist writing. Okay. I hate her writing. I hate everything that she writes and the way that she says it. If you watch a video with her in it, fine, cool. I totally get what you're saying. But reading her books was just the worst, one of the worst nonfiction experiences I have ever had. I could spend 30 minutes rereading a single sentence and still not entirely be sure what she was trying to tell me. That is an accessibility issue. If I were to write any nonfiction books or any books at all, I would want to write in a form that is accessible. And that's probably my main problem with education and academics in general, is that once you're reading the works of people who have masters and PhDs, they write for the academics and not for the world. And I totally think that education should be accessible. And Judith Butler is very, very, very inaccessible, and I think that's a huge problem, because we all deserve to know things whether or not we go to college, and we should be able to access and read the material for those things that we're interested in. So accessibility is huge. That's also one of the huge stereotypes that goes with nonfiction, partially because of people like Judith Butler. Oh, this is a nonfiction? Well, it's going to be boring, and I'm not going to understand what it's saying, and I'm not motivated to read it. Well, here I am to tell you, you can read some of it. Maybe not all of it, Judith Butler, but not all nonfiction is inaccessible and boring and hard to read. There's a lot of it out there that's actually really, really great, and it should be given a chance. So one of the points that I already talked about was humor. The most recent, really funny nonfiction that I read was probably for the Mental Health-a-thon, and that was Furiously Happy by Jenny Lawson. I read her original memoir, Let's Pretend This Never Happened, I think is what it was called, a couple of years ago, and it was kind of weird, but in a really funny way, with the taxidermy and everything. I mean, I had a family of taxidermists growing up, so it's like, oh, I'm not the only weird one out there. And especially listening to the audiobook version of this, which she narrated herself, I had sped it up a little bit, so not only is it a funny memoir about depression and anxiety, but hearing her particular voice on a faster speed just had me laughing out loud the whole time. Humor makes nonfiction more accessible. That same thing would go for Bonk for me, where I was laughing out loud, and just it gets you connected to the author and their writing and their stories if you can find it funny. This also goes back to finding a topic that you're interested in. I'm interested in the topics of depression and anxiety. I suffer anxiety myself. I've got some situational depression that comes up every now and then. And here's depression and anxiety told from a humorous angle. Humor, that's a great coping skill for stuff like depression and anxiety, or really for anything. If you can laugh at something, it's going to feel better. Humorous nonfiction. Go for it. And my last point is to find a style that you like. So in fiction, you have diaries and journals and first person, third person, sometimes second person. Just there's different styles that things are written in. I have selfish, shallow, and self-absorbed. This is my top favorite nonfiction so far this year, and this is an essay collection. So you're getting the voices of 16 different writers. I thought all of their voices were pretty great. And all these different perspectives on this single topic. Then you have things like Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doughty. It's other lessons Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory. Not only was this really funny, I'm interested in death and dead bodies, especially since I've started watching Caitlin Doughty. I did not mean for that to be as creepy as it sounded. Caitlin Doughty has a YouTube channel talking about death, and I think it's a really important subject. I think it's a really interesting subject. I found this book really funny, and it's a memoir where she's telling tales of, here's this thing that happened in the crematory one day. It's great. It's like situational humor. And there's The Psychopath Test. This was a recent read. It wasn't my favorite nonfiction, but it is written by a journalist, and the pages have quite a few page breaks, which can really help, again, go back to my point of breaking up your reading and reading something in sections, making it more accessible. I also really like readings for psychology. I am a psychology major. I work in a treatment center. Books like this are pretty important for me to keep up with. If you're interested in food, there's The Omnivore's Dilemma. I had never really read about food before, and thanks to borrowing this from a friend, I am totally in love with Michael Pollan now and can't wait to read everything else that he's written. This goes over, he goes through like how McDonald's gets its products, and then finishes that section of the book by eating a McDonald's meal through the drive-thru with his family. Towards the end of the book, he goes foraging for his own food and then makes a meal out of that foraged food for all of the people who helped him forage the things like the mushrooms and shooting the pig and stuff like that. He just explores the different places that we eat from, the different processing that we have, and he's not necessarily saying this food's better than that, this way of eating is better than that. He's just informing you of your options. And post-grad is more of a study nonfiction where you're focusing on 5 different women and their first year out of college and how they're dealing with that. This was a really important book for me when I was finishing college and trying to find out what I was going to do with my life, which I still am not entirely sure. But this is really comforting. Like, not everyone has it easy right after college. In fact, probably none of us have it very easy right after college. So, comforting read. It was based on research, but it didn't feel like research. It felt like a personal account. So what are you into? Do you want to read the diaries of a midwife? Do you want to read the memoir of a crematory operator? Are you really interested in food or psychology? Do you think gender is the most fascinating thing and you want to read a bunch of books on it? Find a topic and find a style that you like. I do really like diary and journal setups. Those are similar to epistolary fiction where you're getting the story in journal entries and newspaper clippings. I really like that. I think it's a fun way to access information. All the books have all sorts of different styles, so find a style that you like. So these are kind of my recommendations. Another book I wanted to mention that I have not read yet. If you're into fairy tales, I got The Uses of Enchantment, the Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales, because I want to know about the meaning and importance of fairy tales and how they play into the stories that we read today. So, I hope you get something out of this video. I hope if you don't read nonfiction that you're now maybe willing to give nonfiction a try. Anyone who regularly reads nonfiction, drop a comment down below. Let me know what you think of these, if you have anything to add. And that's what I've got for you. Have a wonderful day. Like, subscribe, be my friend on all of the social media things that are linked down below. Thanks. Bye.